Good evening, everyone. Welcome.
There's probably a procedure about that day.
Welcome to the October 2019 Space Association meeting. Thanks for coming tonight with a bit of a different seating layout and a few new faces. It's great to see you tonight. I'm Peter. I'm the president of the Space Association, and we've got a few of the members and committee members here, and great to see everybody tonight. We've got a really packed show tonight, so we'll get straight into it. So, I don't know whether everyone saw this. This is the leadership of our great democracy. Say no more. There's a story behind it if you want to hear about it, but I'm sure you're probably aware of it. All right, so tonight's program, we're going to start off as usual with a bit of news about the association, what we do, what we're doing, what we've got in mind. And then we're going to go to Space News, first edition of that. We'll have a bit of a look at the Space Agency, Australian Space Agency, a bit of local news. And then we've got our feature presentation with Dr. Rowena Christiansen, who's here tonight. And we're really looking forward to seeing that. We've got a lot of people apparently dialing in and streaming in. So as people may or may not know, this is live streamed to the world. We have people watching from all over the world. Don't be nervous. I believe Tom Hanks and yes, a few others watch it every time. Yeah, so who's the guy that did the Apollo 13 movie? Ron Howard, yes. So apparently he's scouting at the moment. So he's looking for a knowledgeable doctor in medicine. So keep an eye out for that.
Ron Howard of
Not Ronnie Biggs. And then we get a bit of a break at 8:30 if all goes well, and get up, have a chat to somebody you haven't met before, and that's what we're all about here, trying to link up everybody. It's actually a speed dating association. I didn't really want to tell everybody, but this is the main purpose that I've come along to. Don't tell my wife. And it's good to see people who are born in this century too here tonight. We don't have many of those, so thank you for coming. And then we've got a tribute to Alexei Leonov. And where's our Russian correspondent tonight? Igor, is he coming tonight? Anyone know? No. Okay. We have a KGB officer that comes every month as well to keep an eye on everything. And then we're going to have second edition Space News with Angelo de Grazia, who's not here yet, but he should be. He's always tearing up the road there, and he'll screech into the car park shortly. And then we have Andrew Rennie with his Planetary and Space News. So all in all, it's a busy night, and we try to run on time, but sometimes we run a bit late. So we get straight into it, and they'll throw us out at 10 o'clock. So there's bouncers downstairs, so we try to discourage disobedience. But just a bit of information about the association for people who are not familiar with this. We run a news segment during our weekly radio show called The Space Show, and we've got a news segment in there. Obviously, we run our public meetings, which you're participating in tonight. Thank you. We also got some things lined up. We do special events, etc. Apollo 12 anniversary, 50th anniversary is in November. We think we've got an idea of what we're going to do there. And Apollo 13 is next year in April. So we've got a couple of ideas about what we might do there, maybe a special event of some description. And we've also got a few special projects which we're not really onto at this stage, but there might be something hanging around. There's a few things floating in the ether, so we'll keep up to date on that. And we also work with other groups. We've done work with the Royal Aeronautical Society, the Australian Institute of Aviation and Aerospace, the Engineers Australia. So we do a lot of partnerships with other people. And we also have guest speakers, Exhibit A down the front here tonight. And also, if you know somebody who's knowledgeable about space and would be willing to come up and put themselves through the torture of speaking to us, let us know. That'd be great. And as I've mentioned before, we have a weekly radio show. Andrew Rennie over here runs that every week. Hasn't missed a show for 180 years, I believe. Just after they invented radio, it first went out. So, all right. So I ran this last month, but Andrew wasn't here, so I just thought I'd do this again. So our space show on 88.3 Southern FM is live stream and podcast, and also broadcast on the FM. It first went to air in 1991 as a fortnightly half-hour show on Sunday afternoons. And within a few months, it went for a weekly 1 hour show and switched to Wednesday evenings, which it is now, every Wednesday, 7 p.m. It's never missed a week. And this is where the elaborate studios are, where it's broadcast out of Brighton. And this is Andrew Rennie, who's the presenter. This is when he first started the show. So you can see what happens. And this is Andrew now. So you can see what happens when you do radio for a long period of time. Anyway, the reason for this slide is that Andrew gets life. Andrew Rennie got life membership for the Southern FM awarded to him back in a couple months ago. So we thought we'd just mark that event. So he was lauded membership because of the Australia's only dedicated space program. His contribution over 25 years with Southern FM. So, and this is a quote from them. I'm not going to. Oh, gone off the bottom. Yeah. So that's great. Yeah, congratulations, Andrew. Well done. For those of you who are not familiar with our little show here, we do these monthly meetings. The general formula is the fourth Monday of each month. And usually, well, it's been here for the last 12 months. We bounce around whichever venue's going, but we've settled into here for this last 12 months and everyone seems to be quite happy. So hopefully for the foreseeable future, we'll be here. The next meeting will be the November 25. And then because the fourth Monday of December will go into the silly season, we're going to bring it back a week and we're going to be on the 16th of December. So put that in your calendars now. Follow our Facebook feed. And by the way, if you're not on our propaganda list, our mailing list, there's a sheet of paper down there, and if you put your phone number and email address, we will be in touch with you. All right. And we are a volunteer non-profit group. No one gets paid here, so we rely on memberships to do everything we do. And if you're interested, you can see Tim over here, the attractive man down the front with the attractive haircut. And he'll take your money and set you up and just helps the association to do all the things we do. So with that, we'll go on to the next part. And we're calling this Australian Space Agency Watch. So Australia does now have its own space agency, which the association did have a little bit of influence in writing and doing proposals to government prior to the establishment of the agency, so it's our association. We're going to take credit for that. So what I'll do each month is just give you a bit of a rundown of what's happening with the Australian Space Agency, what they've been doing. I'm not going to read all these lines, but they've got a partnership with the UK space industries. They're calling it Space Bridge, and basically it'll be a trade, exchanging trade opportunities between Australia and the UK. So it promises to be a good partnership, and a lot of people have said the UK Space Agency was a good model for the Australian Space Agency with what they've done and how they did it. So I think that's a good synergy there. As I say, all this information is on the Australian Space Agency website if you wanted to go and have a look at that. Tasmania joins the space race. So they've signed an agreement, memorandum of understanding to create jobs and advance this Tasmania's space industry. And I think what they're doing there, establishing a network for Tasmanian businesses and organisations to get involved in the booming space industry. So a bit of PR, but it's all good. Everyone's getting involved. Hello, welcome. Another one, they just signed an agreement with MAXAR, the International Astronautical Congress, which is just completed, I believe, in Washington. Was it Washington? Yeah. So MAXAR is a global provider of advanced space-based technology solutions, and so the partnership financial contributor to the Adelaide-based SmartSat CRC, which is what's CRC stand for? It's a cooperative research. Yeah, so the Australian Space Agency has made funding available for these cooperative research centres, so good stuff. And we predicted this, a lot of activity will be happening with the establishment of this agency, and so every month they're doing lots of things. So once again, the International Astronautical Congress was well represented by Australian firms. They had displays for various firms, and the US Vice President was strongly encouraging international collaboration. A dozen Australian space companies were there. Karen Andrew, the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, and once again, Pence opened it up. So just a couple of things relating to that. Probably not a real Australian space news, but I thought I'd put it in here. Virgin Galactic, there was mention that he's looking for other sites to be running his Virgin Galactic missions from, and included Australia, so hence it gets a slide on this presentation, so that'll be good. Have them taking off and landing in Australia would be lots of fun. This is a good one. Equatorial Launch Australia, they gained approval from the EPA to do their launches out of there, so that would be good. And I'm not sure, I've got it on the map here, I think it's up around here, isn't it, the launch site? Yeah. So they've got, this was a big issue back in the 90s when they were, well, actually it was when Joe Bjelke-Petersen was talking about, in the 80s maybe, up in Gulf, Cape York, the issue with the local indigenous and also the EPA was a bit of a stumbling block. So they're ticking off all these boxes here, so it seems to be going quite well up there for them. And they plan to conduct their first launches next year with 4 NASA sounding rockets. So NASA's been up there and they've scouted the site, etc., etc. Black Sky Aerospace gains a priority access to the Northern Territory launch site. So Queensland Rocket Company, we've got a representative of the company here in the room, so if you want to chat with him, go and harass him during the break. So they've got a priority access to the Equatorial Launch Site in Arnhem Land, or Arnhem Space Centre they're calling it, Northern Territory. So that's good. Black Sky Aerospace have signed a letter, Northern Territory, so they've got future opportunities. Did you have a date on, I thought I read something about it, dates, possible dates, mid next year or something? For launches.
There may be a demonstration launch within 6 months.
Right, there you go. I thought I read that today, yeah, so yeah. Watch this space. Curtin Satellite Navigation Innovator wins there's an award here if you can work out what the hell this is. Prestigious award, Curtin University researcher Professor Peter Toynson is the first scientist from the Southern Hemisphere to receive prestigious Johannes Kepler Award for his game-changing contributions to the development of satellite navigation. And he invented the least squares ambiguity decorrelation adjustment method. So Andrew will stand up and give us a presentation of what the hell that means, but anyway, congratulations, it's good work. All right, now we do have Dr. Rowena Christiansen. I got blisters on my fingers. But I thought I don't want to steal your thunder, Rowena, but I do have some breaking. We've got a live feed to the International Space Station. This isn't it, I just thought I'd put it in here. But this is a medical, I heard it on the radio this morning, so I jumped in. So we're online now, happening up in the International Space Station. So I thought we'd better dial in and see if we can see what's happening up there. Oh, sorry. Standby caller. Here we are. Here we go. This is live from the International Space Station. I like it. All right. I apologise for the dad joke that you witnessed there. Sorry about that. So tonight we've got a presentation called Space 101. I was looking for images on space medicine. I came up with this. But of course we all know the real doctor in space, so I thought I'd put him on. So Dr. Rowena Christiansen is here tonight, and she's... exactly, thank goodness. No pointy ears. So her presentation is Space 101, a primer on the challenges and pitfalls of the human body in space. So Rowena was a Master of Emergency Medicine, a medical educator at the University of the Melbourne Medical School, and also worked as a pre-hospital emergency doctor. Please, I hope I've got all the correct information here. She's undertaken a postgraduate training in emergency medicine and critical care, women and children's health, aviation medicine, space studies, disaster health and emergency management. And she also pursues a special interest in disaster management, pre-hospital and wilderness medicine, extreme environments and aerospace medicine. So if you're feeling unwell, I can't see you, Dr. Rowena. So thank you, Dr. Rowena Christiansen. I'll just get this up for you, Rowena.
Did you click it?
I did. Do it again. There we go. And I'll just move this over. I'll get rid of my drink for you. There you go. And make yourself comfortable. And to advance the slide. Full narrow and then just the laser.
Okay, lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to come and speak to you tonight. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to see so many people who are interested to come along and hear about space medicine. So I'm going to be talking to you about 4 different areas tonight. It's a compilation of 4 of my existing presentations. First of all, Space Medicine 101, so the basic things that happen to the human body in space. Then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges with medical and surgical care in the space environment. Then the interesting question of, can you take your appendix with you if you're going to Mars? And finally, a quick look at space tourism risks and rewards. So there's a lot to go through, and apologies, I might go through some of the slides a little bit quickly, but I'm very happy to talk about anything afterwards. And of course, answer questions at the end. So there's just my affiliations, which is pretty boring, so we'll just skip over that. And so I've divided it up into 4 chapters, as I've just mentioned. So the first one is Space Medicine 101, a primer on what happens to the human body in space. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that the key thing that causes negative effects for humans in space is microgravity. But we need to understand the difference between microgravity and zero gravity, and also to understand that the International Space Station, which is in low Earth orbit, is actually in free fall around the Earth. So that creates a microgravity environment, even though a very large percentage of the Earth's actual gravity is still present at that distance in orbit. And the further away from the Earth you get, then you'll eventually get to a true zero gravity situation, but you'll need to travel about 6 million kilometres to get to that. There are 3 things the human body absolutely can't adapt to. One is the lack of oxygen. The next is the lack of barometric pressure, which is what the atmosphere provides. And the third is high levels of radiation exposure. We can adapt to microgravity conditions, and adaptations occur over both a short and a longer time frame, but not all of those adaptations are positive things. When we're thinking about the adaptations, we need to think about all the different major body systems. There are quite a few of them, so a quick list there. And we're going to start with the cardiovascular system. And something that you might not know is that part of the pressure in our blood vessels, which is called the hydrostatic pressure, is actually due to gravity. So that component is lost in microgravity. And we actually get a shift of fluid towards the upper part of the body. And then when that happens, the pressure receptors, which are in the top part of our body, sense that there's too much fluid there. And so they go, hey, we need to get rid of some of this. So we end up with an increased urine output, which leads to an overall lower circulating blood volume and a reduced central venous pressure. And the phenomenon is called puffy faces and chicken legs. So there's an example there of an astronaut with before and after pictures of what he looked like before he went into space, and you can see that there's a quite visible difference. Astronauts also develop a flushed appearance of their facial skin and nose and mouth. They develop a stuffy nose and then thinning of the lower extremities, hence the chicken legs illusion. The heart actually becomes smaller because it doesn't have to work as hard as it has to on the Earth, because there's no longer that force of gravity it has to work against. So it does become weaker and deconditioned. It's like any muscle in the body. And because of the lack of gravity, like any organs that aren't tightly tied down, the heart can actually float around in the chest a little bit, so you might not necessarily find it in absolutely its normal position. Astronauts get a little bit anemic and they can bleed more easily. And because of that lower circulating volume, when they come back to a gravitational environment, they experience what's called orthostatic hypotension, which is dizziness and sometimes feeling as if they're going to faint and feeling weak, sometimes having coordination problems. So that's very common when they come back to Earth, and it could also be a problem after 6 to 8 months travelling to Mars, and then they suddenly get into the gravitational environment at Mars. With the respiratory system, there is an overall improvement in function. You breathe a little bit more quickly. The diaphragm goes up a couple of rib spaces, but because we normally have some dead space at the bottom of our lungs, that rise in the diaphragm actually compensates for the dead space, so you actually have less dead space to worry about. One thing everyone always likes to hear is that astronauts get a bit taller in space because of the unloading of the spine with the absence of gravity, but people can get back pain as a result of that. And I'm sad to say that when you come back to Earth, you go back to your normal height, so it's not a lasting effect. One of the most concerning effects is the loss of bone mineral density, which actually occurs quite quickly. So the natural process of bone being resorbed dominates over new bone formation. And there's a net loss of calcium from the bone, which goes into the plasma or the bloodstream. And that continues for the entire duration of microgravity exposure. And as you can imagine, that could lead to a risk of fractures or even osteoporosis. It can be reversed when people come back to Earth, but that's a slow process. And because you've got that lower circulating volume and more calcium floating around in your bloodstream, there's actually an increased risk of developing kidney stones. I was talking earlier about the heart as a muscle getting weaker and losing mass, and the same applies to the other major muscle groups in the body. And that loss of fitness and exercise capacity occurs very quickly, 20 to 25% after just 9 to 14 days of spaceflight. So that's why astronauts need to do about 2 hours of exercise on the International Space Station every single day. With the gastrointestinal system, your tummy gets a bit more rounded, the bowel tends to float around because it's not really tied down that tightly. There are some changes in the speed at which material moves through the gut, and there are possible changes in your gut microbiota and nutrient absorption, which can potentially lead to malnutrition if you're not getting the right kind of nutrients. One of the most interesting ones is the changes which occur in our ability to sense where we are in space, because in Earth we have the system in our inner ear which tells us whether we're going up or down or sideways, and that's combined with what we see and the sensors in our muscles and joints to tell us exactly where we are if we're sitting down or standing up. But once you're in the space environment and in microgravity, there is no up or down or sideways. So the vestibular system gets very confused because what the eyes are saying doesn't add up with the lack of inputs as to its actual position. So in the first few days in space, people can develop a form of space sickness, motion sickness, which is called space adaptation sickness, which can last 2 or 3 days. With your eyes, because there is the increased fluid in the top of the body, you can develop a mild raised intracranial pressure, which can lead to blurred vision and potential eyeball shape changes, some of which are permanent for some astronauts. And astronauts also report seeing flashes in their eyes from cosmic radiation. As you can imagine, the interior of a spacecraft is very noisy, so there's the potential for hearing loss, and also it does tend to impact on people's concentration and behaviour, having that constant noise in the background. With the nasal congestion, there's a reduction in the sense of smell, and so astronauts request stronger tasting foods as a result, so things have to be made more spicy. Another concerning area is the stress response, which is activated when astronauts begin training, and it lasts through the entire flight and probably for a short time afterwards. So you get increased production of the stress hormone cortisol, and that can lead to muscle breakdown, increased inflammation, and also it can have a negative effect on your immune system and increase susceptibility to allergies, illness and disease. And then if you marry that with the innate changes to the immune system just from being in an extreme environment, and the space environment in particular, there is an overall reduction in immune function, and it's very common to get reactivation of viruses like herpes or glandular fever. And one interesting fact is that bacteria and viruses become more potent in the space environment. Nobody really understands why at the moment, but if you put that together with a reduced immune system, you can see there's potential for trouble. With the skin, there aren't any showers or baths on the International Space Station, so they don't change their clothing very often, and it has to be impregnated with antibacterial agents. And it has been reported there's a bit of a locker room smell when somebody new comes and opens the hatch. And also your clothing floats around you, so we don't have that sense of clothing actually pressing down on us. Our skin becomes more oily, and because of the immune impact, cuts take longer to heal. The reproductive system is also negatively affected for both women and men. And radiation in particular is a concern because it can damage the eggs in females and the sperm in men, and cause genetic mutations which can be handed down to offspring, and also potentially result in sterility or infertility. And something people often don't think about is dental health, but that's becomes even more important in the space environment because there are a lot of factors which mean that you can't look after your teeth and gums as well as you might normally do so, because of having to be very careful about use of water, having lots of dried meals, and also the microgravity-induced changes in bone density. People always want to know what happens if I step out the airlock without my spacesuit, or if I've had a bit of an argument with someone and I happen to get pushed out the airlock. Well, I'm pleased to say it's not like in the Holly movies. You're not going to explode and all your innards go everywhere, because skin elasticity will keep everything in place. However, because of the sudden absence of pressure, the air in your lungs will want to expand, so it's a good idea to breathe out so that you don't rupture your lungs. You can also get nitrogen bubbling out of your blood, so you can look even more puffy. You could get decompression sickness if you live to tell the tale, and any surface moisture will start to vaporise and boil. You can get hypothermia, it's very cold in space, but you can also get sunburn from cosmic radiation. You lose consciousness in about 15 seconds and you would die in about 2 minutes if you're not rescued. So you do have a small possibility of surviving. So I'm just going to move on to the next section, which is some of the challenges in delivering good healthcare in the space environment. So I won't actually go through this, but there's quite a few things that we need to think about. And first of all, it really starts at the mission planning phase. We need to think about our equipment and resources, the food we're going to take, the type of people that we're going to select to go. And we want to have a personalised risk assessment for all those people and a thorough pre-flight health assessment. We need to think about our medical kit. It's going to need to cover us for general practice type situations as well as emergencies and possibly surgery and anaesthesia. But because weight and bulk is always a consideration, there have to be ways of working out the optimal design for a medical kit, and some very clever people have been working on algorithms to try to maximise the utility of the contents while minimising the actual amount of bulk that you're going to take. One really important issue is thinking about communications delay, and also if evacuation would be a realistic option. So if we're talking about the International Space Station or the Moon, we've only got a very small communication delay, and we can probably evacuate people if they're not critically unstable. But with Mars, depending where you are on the journey to Mars, it could be an 8 to 24 minute each way delay in communications. And so it's going to be unrealistic to evacuate people. And even telemedicine will become difficult the further away we get from the Earth. Telemedicine is very useful. It does have a few dependencies. You need to have power, you need to have the right technology, you need to be able to communicate, and you also need good space weather. And the further out you get, the more problematic it becomes to communicate in a real-time sort of scenario. So particularly going to Mars, telemedicine is going to be an adjunct to the onboard medical care rather than something that you can absolutely rely on. People are going to need to be fairly autonomous. You've probably all heard of robotic surgery. Perhaps some of you have seen the movie Prometheus, which has a rather scary example of robotic surgery in it. This is an example of when it all started. You can see on the lower left side, the surgeon is sitting there and manipulating some controls, which then transmit to the robot, which is actually operating on the patient. So there are two models. One is the in situ model, like that one, where you've got everything, the operator and the equipment together in the one place. And then there's telerobotics, where the operator might be on Earth, for instance, and the robot's on the International Space Station. So once again, there are quite a few dependencies to make that work. And if you're going to have an in situ model, you're going to need people who are very well trained to be able to do that effectively. Going to need to have a good range of laboratory tests, but they're going to need to be portable ones that will give you a result on the spot and that you can actually interpret while you're on the spacecraft. Occasionally you might need to refer to telemedicine, and once we get to the destination and start setting up colonies on the Moon and Mars, I'm sure eventually there'll be laboratory testing facilities, but that's probably going to take a while to get established. Here on Earth, we have lots of lovely modalities for imaging and looking inside the body, but when it comes to spaceflight, there are some very practical restraints because X-rays and the CT scanners and MRI scanners are very large and bulky and heavy. And also MRIs are essentially huge magnets, so they're not going to be very practical to take them into space, at least initially. However, ultrasound is more and more proving its effectiveness for all kinds of different purposes that people didn't envisage initially. It's used a lot in emergency medicine, and they've experimented with it a lot on the International Space Station. And you might have seen on the news in the last couple of days that there is a little handheld version called the Butterfly you can attach to your iPhone, and costs about $3,000 though, so I don't think we'll all be rushing out to get one just yet. You're going to need to have an adequate supply of pharmaceuticals and also vitamins and minerals and supplements. So you're going to have to think about having adequate stock, about shelf life, whether you can use one medication for multiple purposes, and also the issue of radiation. Is exposure to cosmic radiation going to make medicines deteriorate more quickly? You might not often hear good nutritional support referred to as something that's really important for clinical medicine, but it's been identified by NASA as being really important, the risk of inadequate nutrition, plus also the risk from the altered immune response. And we need good nutrition to try to work against some of the bad things that happen in spaceflight, like loss of muscle mass and body weight, loss of bone mineral density, and the negative changes that happen to the immune system. Food security is always going to be an issue, particularly for longer space flight. And you may be able to grow some basic plant-type foods, but probably just as on Earth, a purely vegan or vegetarian diet may need to be supplemented. And another issue is that the gut microbiome is an important part of our immune system. So in order to maintain that, we need a good balance of both prebiotic, fibre-rich foods and probiotic, for instance, fermented foods that contain the good bacteria. So just as an example, probiotics are things like yogurt and sauerkraut and kombucha and kimchi, and prebiotic, very fibrous vegetables. Another thing that we need to think about is what type of doctor do we want to take? Do we want to take a generalist or a specialist or both? And one of the things that we'll need to think about going to Mars is if we only have, say, 6 seats on the spacecraft, we're probably not going to have the luxury of taking more than one doctor. So probably someone like our Australian rural generalists is going to be a really good type of doctor to take on those first missions to Mars. I always like to think about the elephants in the room, the things that people don't always talk about, and one is the issue of the possibility of humans being humans and pregnancy occurring, and what happens with pregnancy and childbirth in a microgravity environment. Are little humans who grow up in the absence of gravity essentially going to be a new race of humans or a new species of humans? So interesting questions that really haven't been thought about too much, or if they have been thought about it, very quietly. And another elephant in the room for surgery and anaesthesia is gravity, because we only have 1/6 of Earth gravity on the Moon and 1/3 on Mars. And what if we need to do CPR? You probably remember the principle from high school: for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And you can imagine what would happen in microgravity if you're trying to push down on someone's chest. So you have to try to develop methods of anchoring people so that they don't fly away, and it really is very challenging.
Do they already have those? Like, obviously we've got people in space right now. Have they developed a way of doing that?
Well, the three methods that you can see there are the ones that have been tested, and the one on the top left-hand corner, the handstand method, has been shown to be the most effective. So I imagine that that's probably the one that they go with at the moment. With surgery, we're always going to have blood, and so there's going to be the issue of keeping blood out of the way. And in microgravity, venous blood tends to adhere to the local surface due to surface tension, so it tends to spread across the operating surface. And then arterial blood will spurt out and form droplets, as seen in sci-fi movies, and that can also get in the way and contaminate things. Bacteria also float around in the air rather than settling down, as they tend to do on Earth, so there's an increased risk of contamination to the surgical site and post-operative infection. And also there's the issue of what if we strike new pathogens, for instance on the moon or Mars, how are we going to react to those and deal with those? And just things that we find simple on Earth, such as sterilising equipment, are going to be quite challenging. And with anaesthesia, there are some special issues there. Inhaled anaesthetics are really effective, but you can't use them in a spacecraft because you'll end up anaesthetising everybody. We're not sure yet how people will react to anaesthetic agents due to those changes in cardiovascular physiology I was talking about earlier. So they've been looking a lot at how people do things in pre-hospital medicine. For instance, ketamine is a very versatile anaesthetic and analgesic agent, and the use of regional anaesthesia, so just anaesthetising a certain part of the body rather than the whole body. And if you do use a muscle paralysing agent, you need to use one that you can reverse quickly in case of emergency. And one interesting thing is that fluids don't flow downwards in the absence of gravity, so you would actually need to attach pressure bags to bags of fluid in order to get them to pump into the patient. And I think one of the issues we really need to consider is whether we need to do surgery in the first place, or whether there are other treatment modalities or algorithms that we could go down. For instance, IV antibiotics for suspected acute appendicitis. Just a couple of early habitat designs I found in one of my old space books. And that segues quite neatly into, can I take my appendix with me if I'm going to Mars? So prophylactic appendicectomy, that is taking your appendix out as a precaution, has been raised as a possible requirement for long duration spaceflight, and it's presently required for Australian wintering doctors down in Antarctica. Australia is the only Antarctic country that requires that. And that was because there was one death now over 50 years ago. So this is not current NASA policy, and it's not one of what NASA regards as one of the key risks to human health and performance. And I think there are some interesting ethical issues that people don't talk about, and that is, can you really justify asking someone to take out a perfectly healthy organ just for employment purposes? And what happens if something goes wrong? Who should be responsible for that? Should the employer have a long-term responsibility to the astronaut to look after them and monitor them for complications? So there are probably a few of you here who grew up thinking that your appendix was totally useless and it didn't matter if you didn't have one. Well, it's interesting that there's a whole body of research going back to the mid-1970s that shows that the appendix is an important part of the gut immune system. And if you look at evolutionary biology, it does appear to have evolved to have a purpose. It contains stem cells to repair damage. It contains lymphoid tissue and infection-fighting immune cells, which, amongst other things, prevent damage to the appendix itself. And this is really important for people with compromised immune systems. And so we need to reflect at that point that people in space are going to have compromised immune systems, both because of the effect of the environment itself and also the stress response when people go into space. So your appendix is a bit like a Trojan horse. It's a reservoir for good bacteria, and it can repopulate the gut with good bacteria after an infection, and it releases them down a biofilm slide. So it's a pretty neat mechanism for doing that. One thing that we always do need to think about is being sure that it's appendicitis before we do anything drastic like cut it out. And that's really dependent on good history and physical examination. There are various scoring systems and algorithms. We should do laboratory tests to look for signs of infection, and imaging is becoming increasingly used, and ultrasound is actually quite good for looking to see if there is an actual problem with the appendix. So if you do suspect appendicitis, what can you do about it? You might be interested to know that some cases do resolve spontaneously. And as well as appendicectomy, there's good quality evidence for the use of antibiotics at first instance before you go to surgery. So you've actually got quite a few options. You might try antibiotics first and then go to surgery, or antibiotics might fix the problem. And even if the appendix ruptures, there's an interesting series of cases from French nuclear submarines where they put some drains in through the skin and got all the infection out and continued treating the people with antibiotics, and everyone lived to tell the tale. So even in that situation, it's not absolutely necessary to do appendicectomy on the spot. There are risks of surgical complications. Any surgery with anaesthetic always carries risks. And a 2014 Swedish study showed that approximately 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 people will experience some sort of complication, whether that's a medical or a surgical complication. And if we are dealing with people who've got immune suppression from extreme environments, then the loss of the immunoprotective role of the appendix may actually provide an additional layer of risk. Sorry for the gory slides, a couple of gory slides coming up, just to warn you. So these are just some example of post-operative wound infections, which are relatively common, and you can probably see from both of those it would have taken a while to sort those out. And another probably more concerning complication is whenever you do surgery in the abdomen, there's a risk of fibrous adhesions developing, and they can tie bits of bowel together, or the bowel can twist around them, and that can result in a small bowel obstruction, which is a medical emergency. And it's a very interesting fact that risk never completely goes away. So even 30 years down the track, there's still a 1.3% risk. And Chris Hadfield actually had an interesting story about that. He had an appendicectomy when he was 11. He had a couple of later episodes due to adhesions. And while he was training to go to the International Space Station, the NASA doctors were worried that he might have more adhesions, so they wanted to open him up and have another look. But understandably, he and his family and his doctors weren't very keen on that because they thought it could just potentially make things worse. And in the end, they agreed that they'd do an ultrasound examination, which turned out to be normal, and he got to go and fly. I've looked at a very large range of studies which look at long-term health risks following appendicectomy, and it turns out there is an increased risk of a whole range of quite significant chronic diseases. You can see the list up there, but just to pick out a few: Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis. So I think that's something that people certainly aren't generally aware of, but it's probably something that does need to be communicated to people a little bit more broadly, and it certainly, I think, does argue against the whole idea of prophylactic appendicectomy. One interesting thing is, though, there are a lot of studies that show that appendicectomy does appear to be protective against ulcerative colitis. So at least that's one positive thing. Some of these risks can occur quite early after surgery, so this may mean that maybe we should be monitoring some people a little bit more closely. And I think that these findings also have implications for medical practice generally. Because if we had fewer appendicectomies, we'd have less chronic disease, less effect for the people concerned, and less financial burden on the health system. And if you think about long duration space exploration and settlements, perhaps you're more of a liability if you don't have an appendix because of the ever-present risk of adhesions and bowel obstructions. And it would be very difficult to manage these serious chronic diseases off-world. So I think there's an argument that having an appendix might actually be protective for expeditioners as opposed to being a liability. So if you don't have an appendix, should you be worried? I think so long as you mitigate your risk, you don't need to be worried. The best way to do that is to eat a healthy diet, for instance, Mediterranean type diet, have plenty of probiotics and prebiotics, and the usual things: exercise regularly, sleep well, and manage stress. All those sort of things your mother always told you. And if we think about, is the appendix a friend or foe? I think there's certainly a mounting evidence to show that it's more of a friend and a foe. And I'm hoping over time medical practice might change to making sure that we get our diagnosis right and then trying antibiotics first rather than rushing into surgery. And there's just a quote there about believing impossible things from Alice in Wonderland. And finally, I'm just going to whiz through a little bit of discussion about space tourism. So probably most people in this room have wanted to be astronauts at some stage, or perhaps some of you would still like to be an astronaut. So it's good that we have a space agency now, but still for the time being, unless you're American or European, we're probably not going to get to fly anytime soon. So space tourism sounds pretty cool, and surely it must be safe if they're offering it. But it's still a little bit of an unregulated Wild West. Entrepreneurs are still ahead of the regulators. And where we have any big gathering of people, there's always going to be potential for a mass casualty type situation. And then on an individual level, we need to balance the desire to fly with the question of, should you fly? Are you well enough and fit enough to fly? So we're thinking about disaster generally. There's always going to be mishaps in any form of human exploration, and we have had some very sad ones in spaceflight. Apollo 1 in 1967, the 3 astronauts died. The loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986, Columbia in 2003, and the Virgin Galactic prototype crash in 2014. So it's something that's always going to happen. We can do our best to prepare for it and avoid it, but we can't completely rule out the possibility. If we do want to fly, we're going to take off from a spaceport, and there are more and more spaceports being built all the time. There are quite a few around the world at the moment. That's just a diagram of some of the major ones. As mentioned earlier, Richard Branson has expressed interest in setting up a spaceport in Australia, and apparently we have some travel agencies who have already partnered with Virgin Galactic. And there is discussion that space tourism could be a transformational service with potential for social good, for instance, doing research at the same time as flying people for fun. So we just think for a moment about spaceports. They're going to be busy places. There's going to be a lot of people, and as well as employees, there's going to be people who'd like to come along and watch. There's going to be lots of flammable fuel and other chemicals. So there's always going to be a risk of things blowing up or things dropping out of the sky, and we can't completely avoid that risk existing, but we can try to mitigate it, and it's going to be really important to have a good emergency management plan. A lot of spaceports will be in remote areas that are a long way from major hospitals and trauma centres, so we're also going to need good evacuation plans. And one point which doesn't seem very clear at the moment is the different insurance responsibilities between spaceports and commercial spaceflight operators. So that's certainly going to need to be clarified. Now for the fun bit, I'm just going to run through the options that you have. So you could take a parabolic flight like the NASA Vomit Comet. There's a commercial version which flies out of France for approximately $10,000 Australian, and you get about 5 minutes of zero gravity weightlessness in 20-second bursts with that. But this was a good example to think about whether there are any fitness requirements, and the actual company offering it, Novaspace France, also does a lot of work for space agency and government, so it takes a very conservative approach to safety. You need a medical clearance certificate and an ECG, and there are also a large number of disqualifying medical conditions or conditions that they will need to assess you individually. There's only about a 10% incidence of motion sickness actually, so it's a lot less than we might have been led to believe by the name Vomit Comet. There's also going to be suborbital balloon rides, which will go up to about 31 kilometres. You'll be able to see the curvature of the Earth, only US $75,000. With that one, they're certainly recommending that there should be training and medical requirements. There's a lot of discussion about hypersonic flight, and Boeing is proposing to have a hypersonic aircraft which will fly at a similar altitude to the balloon, and you get to see the curvature of the Earth and blackness of space above. I don't have any figures on the cost for that, I'm afraid. And unfortunately, even though 90 to 100 kilometres is the edge of space, the air up there is too thin for conventional aircraft, so they have to fly at a lower altitude. Virgin Galactic is still hoping to launch its commercial flights by the end of 2019. They're planning to fly to between 100 and 160 kilometres. You get about 6 minutes of zero gravity weightlessness, only US $250,000 each, but as you mentioned before, there's over 600 people who've already booked a ticket. Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin is going to be launching capsules on top of a reusable rocket. You get an 11-minute flight and a few minutes of weightlessness. They've reached over 100 kilometres in altitude in tests, and then you get a bit of a hard landing in the West Texas desert, and a cost of 200,000 US has been quoted for that one. If you're incredibly rich, there's going to be some space station options. The Aurora Hotel will give you a 12-day stay for $10 million. It'll be similar to the International Space Station. It'll be in low Earth orbit, completing a trip around the planet every 90 minutes. There are a couple more proposals. Bigelow Aerospace, which has already attached a prototype to the International Space Station. They're planning to expand on this and hoping to launch in 2021. And also Axiom Space from Texas wants to develop its own space station. And then there's the Gateway Foundation, which plans to build the Von Braun space station to be operational a few years later, and it will have artificial gravity, or at least that's the proposal. Probably most of you have seen 2001 and the beautiful rotating space station film. In previous years, Russia did have a program which allowed people to fly into orbit on the International Space Station, cost you 20 to 40 million. There are some reports they're going to start that up again in the next couple of years. And in June it was announced that NASA is going to open up some short duration private missions to the International Space Station. They're going to cost around $35,000 a night US for each passenger, together with the costs for actually flying to the International Space Station and back again. And then if you're a Japanese billionaire, you can fly around the moon on the top of SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket for a mere $100 million. So we do need to think about safety. We need our spaceship to be safe. It has to withstand high G-forces and the subspace environment. It also has to be able to launch, fly and land safely, and noting that launching and landing are traditionally the phases of flight where aircraft crash the most. It has to protect us from the environment outside, so it's going to be very low atmospheric pressure, very, very cold and almost no oxygen. We're going to need some pretty good pilots to be able to get us up there and back. And astronauts can spend a lifetime training for their missions to space. And I guess we're hoping that our space pilots will also have had quite a long apprenticeship. And for us, we need to be suitably trained, we need to have the right kind of clothing, and we need to be protected from the environment. And also something for ordinary people, we need to be able to cope with the stress and anxiety of going into space and experiencing something completely new that we've never experienced before, in addition to the physiological stresses. There will be things like supplemental oxygen, and there are proposals for body-hugging pressure suits, as in these photographs, to help protect against sudden depressurization and hypoxia. So it still is a little bit of a Wild West. There is very little regulation at the moment. The Federal Aviation Administration in the US, the only requirements for training are that you need to know how to respond to an emergency situation, and at the moment it's being left up to the operators as to what kind of specific training people are going to get. And there's actually far more extensive provisions about informing people about the risk aspect of the flight. Virgin Galactic will be offering a 3-day pre-flight training program, and they are going to have doctors around to help with making sure that people are adequately prepared. And in contrast, Blue Origin is only going to offer a 1-day training session. If you want to, you can sign up yourself for training at the NASDAR Center in the US. You can have basic and advanced suborbital training, get to go in a centrifuge and altitude chamber, but you do need to be in good health and capable of taking part in all activities. And there's going to be a huge centre open in the in the UK in a couple of years that will include all those features and more, including a 50-metre pool to simulate being in space. So the last thing that I want to talk to you about is who should be a space tourist. With astronauts, only the fittest and healthiest people get to fly, but what about the rest of us? And it's likely the bar is going to be set a lot lower. But as to exactly what people are going to require, that's very unclear at the moment. And although the FAA doesn't require a physical examination, I did find hidden away in one of their reports that they actually recommend one. And that's something which is conveniently been ignored by a lot of people. And we anticipate that passengers may need to visit a specialist aerospace doctor for a space medical before they fly, and also that they need to have a proper assessment of their response to training, for instance, in a centrifuge. So people with pre-existing conditions won't necessarily be excluded, but we just have to make sure that they're well enough to fly. And there's no way of predicting who's going to develop space motion sickness, so this is something that's going to have to be managed because it's something that we probably can't prevent entirely. But as you can imagine, it could possibly be a bit of a hazard depending on the circumstances. So I think that's something that they'll have to plan for. There are still a lot of unknowns, and the jury will be out until we start to collect data from commercial spaceflight. But the FAA has commissioned 3 studies to look at how ordinary people react to being in a centrifuge. And people from 19 to 89 with a large variety of common medical conditions were able to tolerate the centrifuge quite well. But 6% decided to stop because they felt anxious or they developed motion sickness. And probably the most concerning thing is that 14% had what are cutely named unsafe or potentially problematic behaviours. So people reacting badly to the experience and sort of let me out of here type of thing. So you don't really want that happening in a spacecraft at 100 kilometres above the Earth. We are going to need ongoing dialogue about medical screening and training. And I think that we do need to take the potential for disaster seriously, both from the mechanical side, the spaceport side, but also the risk of adverse health events for individuals. Because if somebody does happen to die because they really shouldn't have gone up on a space tourism flight, there's going to be a lot of negative fallback from that, and it could potentially set things back quite considerably. And risk is something that we should never, nor can, be complacent about. And I really like the quote from George Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Lastly, just sort of thinking about global ethics. If you think about 600 people have booked a flight at $250,000 each, that's $150 million. And you can see the cartoon on the left there saying, gee, look at all those poor people down there. And then on the other hand, we have UNICEF looking for donations to help bring clean running water to villages in Africa and help young girls to stay in school. So I think these are conversations that we need to have. I'm sure everyone here thinks that space is glamorous and exciting and cool, which it is, but we can't afford to forget the people who are being left behind, and our global responsibility to make sure that everyone ends up benefiting from humanity's journey towards the stars. And that's the end. So.
Good question. You're talking about the muscle
Yes.
Have they looked into steroids that they use down the gym to puff up their muscles? Is that something applicable for spaceflight? Or?
That's a really good question, and steroids are sorry, that's a really good question. Steroids are really effective, but the trouble with steroids is that they will actually compound the immune problems, because they actually cause you to have a weakened immune system. So on top of the weakened immune system from being in a space environment and the stress that you're already under, you kind of would end up with a triple whammy. So although in theory it's a good idea, in practice I think that would be the main problem. Yes?
Awesome, thank you. And two real questions. You said about how calcium in the bones and bone density when you're in space, how it increases. And that's something you can obviously not get back when you get back onto Earth. It's something that once it's gone, it's gone. But why does it go into the bloodstream?
The reason for that is that there's a natural process with bone which happens all the time, that older bone is broken down and new bone is made, and when you go into space, that process of breaking down exceeds the rate at which new bone is made, and so that results in a net exit of calcium into the bloodstream, because you've got this excess of bone being broken down, so the calcium from the bone has to go somewhere. And instead of being made into new bone, it goes into the bloodstream.
And why does with the lowered immune system, what about the natural bacteria that are on your skin at all times in all parts of your body? Are they still in the same levels when you're in space, or does that decrease rapidly also? So the bacteria that you've got in your body at all times that protects you, is a big part of your first line of defence in your immune system. Is that no longer present, or is it completely different?
You'll still have bacteria on your skin, and all the normal bacteria that we have on Earth tend to be up on the International Space Station, plus a few interesting ones which aren't necessarily part of our normal collection of bacteria that we carry around. And also, I guess because astronauts don't wash so often, they probably tend to get a greater accumulation of some bacteria on their skin, but because they're sort of the friendly ones that don't do them harm, unless there was something like a deep cut which got infected, there seems to be this sort of cohabitation model works quite well, even up in space.
No human's ever been more, it's been in space, has ever been more than about 3 days away from a very good planet. And as soon as we go beyond the moon, then that's when most of this becomes a reality. So for example, surgery. How do we know whether it's going to work in space? I don't think anyone's going to fly someone into space to take their appendix out just to give it a go and see what happens. So is the first time that surgery in space is ever actually done likely to be on a long duration mission when something goes wrong or someone gets ill? What's the thinking of that in the space medical science community?
There have certainly been some experimental procedures carried out both in parabolic flight and on the International Space Station, generally just small-scale things. They have done some surgery using pigs on parabolic flight. But the first time that there's an emergency requiring surgery is probably going to be on one of those long duration missions, because that's never actually happened so far.
So there's no real way to test other than to do it. But I guess someone could fly a live animal to space and do surgery on it. And that's not that unethical and done all the time. It may be politically incorrect due to the profile to do that. So surgeons practice heart transplants on pigs all the time, no one thinks twice about it. The moment someone put a live pig into space to take its appendix out or something similar, I think it would be a huge political outcry, so it's a dilemma.
At least they'll have bacon.
That's right.
I think there are a lot of experiments don't necessarily hear about too. I think probably some things are done on a need to know basis, and certainly there are people thinking about different ways of these containment issues with blood in space, and I didn't include the slides just because of the sort of, I guess, brevity of what I needed to do, but there have been various systems proposed that it would, at least in a localised area, help to contain the amount of blood and enable people to operate cleanly. But I think it is going to be one of these watch this space things, and it's not really until people start to get a body of experience that we'll really know how difficult or easy it is.
That was a fantastic presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
How much of the overall biomedical risk profile could be attributed to the launch and landing phases? You see that's a high stress and strain area with high rapid accelerations and decelerations. How much of the overall risk profile would contribute to those two phases?
I think for professional astronauts, that's managed fairly well. They seats and strapping to protect them. They also fly in small capsules, so there's not actually that much room to bounce around and cause trauma. And also they have a lot of training to get used to G-forces and the sort of techniques that you can use to try to minimise the possibility of blacking out and so on. But the first time you go up in a rocket, I guess, is still unlike anything that you've actually done in training. So there certainly have been people who've blacked out, and it does put enormous strain on the body. It does make people feel very tired after they've been through it. And
So what I'm leading to, do you think we're making any change to the overall risk profile if there were more sedate ways of getting to and from space? Like, for instance, at some time in the future, we theorise we are the size of the space elevator. Well, we have the science, we don't have the technology. So that's a very sedate 100 kilometres per hour.
Yes, I think that would minimise the risk for individuals, because with any high accelerations and decelerations, you're always going to get shear forces going on. There's always the potential for sort of micro damage to a lot of structures in the body. Things like retinal hemorrhages, for instance, could occur as a result of those kind of rapid accelerations and decelerations. So if you had a more sedate way of getting into space, overall, yes, that would be a lower risk profile.
I've got a couple of questions. First one is things like on the International Space Station, things like the common cold, the influenza, have they experienced that there and it's gone through the crew, or it's been just the way it happens on Earth?
Yes, they have experienced it and has gone through everybody on the International Space Station. Yes, just like it does on Earth.
The second question is, what has that image got to do with this?
That was Norwegian National Day in 2004 when I was a medical exchange student in Oslo, and that's a place called Kringsjå, which is on the edge of Oslo. And it was, I guess, the place where I really started to develop a strong interest in expedition and wilderness medicine, because, of course, there's so much beautiful wilderness there, and being out on cross-country skis for extended period, and so that was sort of the place I started thinking about things like hypothermia and how do you keep people healthy in extreme environments. So it's kind of personal meaning.
I read that when Scott Kelly came back up this year in space, media reported that he was no longer a twin with his brother. How radical was the change? What did they mean by that?
They meant that there were some small changes in sort of things like epigenetics as a result of having been living in a completely different environment for 12 months. Things like the gut microbiome, which also change because you have a limited range of food that you can get on the International Space Station, as opposed to on Earth. You can eat whatever you like, whenever you like. And so they were more subtle changes, and the last report I saw on the twin study seemed to suggest that after a period back on Earth that they sort of converged more together again. That immediately after he came back from his year in space, there were some subtle differences, nothing major. But after he got used to being back on Earth, that those things more or less reversed themselves, and there isn't too much difference again between them now.
Have they detected any cosmic ray damage, any mutations?
I haven't read enough about the reports to be able to answer that specifically. I'm sorry.
Just on the back of that, so like how effective is the shielding that they'll have, say, on the ISS for cosmic radiation? Is it blocking out a majority, or is there still quite a lot coming through, or is it just through heading outside the station kind of thing?
Because the International Space Station's in low Earth orbit, it's still protected by Earth's magnetic field, and so cosmic radiation isn't too much of an issue for people on the International Space Station. They do receive a higher dose of cosmic radiation than, for instance, airline pilots, but it's not something that is of major concern, and it's still within the guidelines that they set for astronauts. There are guidelines for astronauts as well as commercial pilots. But once people travel outside the protection of the Earth's magnetic field, for instance, on the way to Mars, then cosmic radiation is going to be a major issue. And at the moment, we don't have any really good solutions in terms of shielding. They're thinking about a whole lot of different things, but they haven't really settled on anything yet that's going to be the go-to method that's light enough to be able to fit the requirements of the spaceship.
One last one after expresses brains in space. Being, I'm not sure alleged or actually reported, that they suspect that on Apollo 15, Jim Irwin had a workload, had a stress that ultimately led to his demise at a relatively early age. From heart disease. So may have been predisposed to it. He may have had some weakness. There's something about the workloading in the 16G that they say he overstressed.
And they say it was due to his training, sweating so much.
He lost too much potassium. That's why at Apollo 16 they overcompensated with potassium-rich orange juice that the young was complaining about because it made him fart a lot. So, do you have any space on all that as well?
Is that there was a study that came out maybe last year or the year before, about Apollo era astronauts having a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease than the regular population, and I've also read that the Apollo astronauts did have a lot of trouble with excessive workloads and overheating in their spacesuits, and that sort of hypothermia and heat stress became a major issue for them. So these are all things, unfortunately, that individuals end up suffering, but we learn from as we go forward.
So they sound like management things rather than the space environment itself.
Yeah.
Actually, just on that, I think sun exposure. So there's a certain benefit from sun exposure. Obviously, they don't get that directly in the space station in Antarctica. Is that just a vitamin type thing that they manage?
Yes, they give them vitamin D supplementation. Gosh.
You mentioned the possibility of one of those commercial ventures having artificial gravity, 1/3 the Earth's gravity. Do you think that would be enough to alleviate most of the microgravity?
The one that's been proposed only has 1/6.
Well, 1/6, do you think that?
No, I don't think that will be because it's still going to be a very low gravity environment. The negative changes probably won't happen as quickly as they do at microgravity, but they'll still be happening overall, because there's sort of too much of a difference between 1Gs, which is what we've perfectly evolved to, and sort of 1/6.
So the supplementary question is, how close to 1G do you need to get rid of 80-90% of the problem?
That's a $60 million question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We don't know the answer to that, but I'm really interested to answer to it.
Yeah, they've all got it wrong. They're all going to Mars. They should be going to Venus.
Space exploration has given us some incredible technologies that have turned out to be very useful on Earth for uses that are not related to space at all. Do you have any favourite examples from the medical field, either that already exist or that you think might happen in the future because of space exploration?
Probably my favourite example is for those of you here who've watched Star Trek, and the idea of a portable diagnostic tricorder that you can carry around with you and work out what's wrong with people. And there are actually people working on prototype models that would make that a real thing for space exploration. And I think now that we've got these little portable ultrasound devices the size of a cigarette packet, that's something that could be incorporated into a device like that. And if you think on Mars that you're going to have astronauts probably running around in thinner spacesuits than what they need in when they're actually out in the complete unprotected space environment. But if you're out on a mission for the day and something goes wrong, you might be a long way from base, and it would be really good to have a sort of portable diagnostic kit that would try to help you work out what's wrong and what you need to do to get that person well enough to get them back to the habitat.
Oh, we'll just have one last question here, so give you
Have there been any studies on rates of fertility
These have looked at that, and what I was told by one of the Chinese doctors who's the leading researcher is that because they had detected some abnormalities, they actually grounded their female astronauts from flying again. So that was quite interesting. I'm not sure from a Western perspective if we've done any studies like that, but I thought the Chinese example is definitely interesting.
Can I ask a tiny question to add on to that?
just like, have any astronauts come home, done what adults do, had a baby, and it's turned out weird?
You call it weird.
It's good, I just wonder whether, you know.
Which has been publicly reported.
Astronaut and have a normal baby that's not, slightly,
Yeah.
slightly unusual.
There's been 2 astronauts married, but I don't know whether they and Thomas married an astronaut. They haven't had kids, have they, since they flew?
Usually too old.
Alright, thank you very much, Rowena. It was wonderful. We'll stay around for a little while. So we're just going to take a break. I'll get on the microphone here. Thanks.
That was fantastic. So I'm just now, I'm starting a fundraising thing for my Virgin Galactic flight. So any spare cash, credit cards, just beat them up the front. We're going to take a break now for about, how long are we doing, Mike? 20 minutes? 20 minutes. So feel free, get up, say hello to someone you haven't met before. Get a drink, etc. And we'll pick up after the break with a look back at the life of Alexei Leonov and our extensive round of global space and planetary news. We've got a couple of things also. This book, Australia in Space, a comprehensive history of the Australian history in space, of our activities, etc., going way back to post-World War II, Woomera, up to quite recently. This was released, this updated edition was released at the 2017 International Astronautical Congress in Adelaide. They're available for purchase. They're $49.95, I believe. And I'm not sure any of you qualify for this, but we've got we've got 6 of these T-shirts, 3 extra small and 3 small T-shirts commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. This is a unique Australian edition. It has the date of the landing and the moonwalk in Australia as it was, which is 21st of July, not the 20th as it was in the US. So come up and see us if you're interested. Can't remember how much. $30? 30? I think the $30, yeah. So yeah, small or extra small, but they're pretty generous. Okay, thanks. We'll take a break. Okay, we're ready. We're back. Okay, so second half of the show, I will refrain from dancing and singing. Thank you. I'm just going to play a 2-minute video, which was sort of a segment in the lead up to the Rocket Lab launch that happened a little while ago, and I thought it was quite good, so I thought you might like to see that. It only goes for about 2 minutes, I think it is. I can get my, what's the name? There we go. End of Rocket Lab.
Launch Complex 1. This is one of 2 Rocket Lab launch sites for the Electron launch vehicle. It was built in 2016, and we can support up to 120 launches here per year. Launch Complex 1 is located on the stunning Mahia Peninsula on New Zealand's east coast. Limited air and marine traffic and a wide range of orbital inclinations from 39 degrees all the way up to sun synchronous make this the best spot in the world for launching more frequently than anywhere else on the planet. We're standing inside the vehicle hangar today at Launch Complex 1. This is the last stop for Electron before orbit. At the peak of launch operations, we have around 40 to 50 people here to support launch. The individual components of the Electron launch vehicle are assembled and tested at different facilities at Rocket Lab. That includes the 3D printed Rutherford engines, which come from our Huntington Beach facility, as well as some avionics components, which are then shipped down to our Auckland production complex, where they are inspected and sent out for final integrated testing. Once the engines complete their integrated testing, they're brought back to Auckland, where they're integrated into the launch vehicle stages themselves, and then those stages are shipped out to LC1 for final test and assembly. We're inside the clean room at Launch Complex 1. This is where the satellite gets integrated to the payload plate, which is mounted on the kick stage, and then the payload gets put into the fairing in a process called encapsulation. In this clean room, this is the last time human hands will touch the satellites before the fairing opens up and they're deployed in space. Inside the clean room, we process the payloads and then perform final electrical and mechanical mate to our kick stage, which you see in front of me. During encapsulation, the payload is already mechanically and electrically mated to the kick stage. At that point, we break over the entire kick stage and payload assembly. We roll the fairing in from the doors, and then we precision roll the fairing over the top of the kick stage plus the payload. Then we perform a final mate, and it's ready to be mounted to the launch vehicle itself. LC1 has 2 clean rooms, so we can dual process 2 payloads at the same time. Just outside of this clean room, we have a dedicated customer area, so customers can sit and observe the payload integration process without being gowned up in this special clean facility. Welcome to the business end of Launch Complex 1. This is Electron's launch platform, and it's where all the action happens on launch day. 65 tons of steel go into this custom-designed launch mount and strongback. In the hours before liftoff, Electron is rolled out of the vehicle hangar horizontally, then the strongback secures onto the rocket and lifts it vertical, ready for launch. At about T-minus 3 hours, we begin fueling operations to fill Electron with a highly refined kerosene and liquid oxygen for the Rutherford engines to burn through on their way to orbit. The focus tends to be on Electron at the moment of liftoff, but if you look closely, you'll see some clever ground systems at work too. Around 45 seconds before the Rutherford engines of the Electron ignite, a water deluge system starts spraying hundreds of liters of water per minute at the base of the rocket. The water helps dampen the noise created by the roar of the rocket as it lifts off. So when you see the big cloud at the base of Electron during liftoff, that's actually just a big cloud of steam created when the heat from the engine flames meets the water from the deluge system. The last stop on today's tour is range control. On launch day, every seat behind me is filled with operators on console. Each operator on console here is monitoring the vehicle, the pad, and the payload to make sure that it's ready for launch. That means everything from weather and ground systems all the way through to propulsion and avionics systems on the launch vehicle itself. The final countdown comes from Mission Control in Auckland, but the team that's based here is closest to the action during liftoff. At just under 3 kilometers from the pad, the team here gets a pretty spectacular view from the window right over there. After a lot of months of hard work, it's a great way to celebrate with a front row view of the launch.
Whole centre in Auckland. There we go. I thought you'd like to see that, being space geeks as we are. So this month marked the departure of Alexei Leonov on the 11th of October. So I thought we'd give a quick overview of him and his career and a bit of his life. So I've just got a few slides here on Alexei. I'm probably destroying the way he's pronounce his name, but I won't go through every piece of this, but he was born in Litvinenka. Igor will be ashamed of my pronunciation. And interesting, his father was arrested and declared an enemy of the people in 1936. Supposedly he was involved in the revolution. In Stalin's purges. They moved to Kemerovo, and he was compensated for wrongfully being imprisoned. So, he started his flying career. He graduated from secondary school in 1953. He'd always had an interest in art, but the Academy of Arts was the tuition costs were too high, so he decided to join the flying school or the aviation. So he got into the aviation business, 1955, and pilot school. 1957 he graduated with honours degree, commissioned as a lieutenant in the 113th Parachute Division. obviously I'm skipping over a lot of details here, but he was selected as one of the 20 Soviet Air Force pilots as part of the cosmonaut training program in '60. He had 2 space flights. His walk in space was originally supposed to be taken place on Vostok 1, but it was cancelled. The historic event happened on Vostok 2 instead. He was outside the spacecraft for 12 minutes. We've got a little bit of a video later on. If we get time, we'll run that. But he'd spent 80 months undergoing training. His spacesuit it inflated in the vacuum space to a point where he could not re-enter the airlock, and he opened a valve to release some of the pressure to fit back into the airlock. So pretty scary. There's a movie that I think has been released or was about to be released on that. This is interesting stuff here. He was selected command of the first circumlunar mission that they had planned, the Soyuz 7K L1 flight, but it was cancelled because of delays in achieving a reliable circumlunar flight. Only later Zond 7 and Zond 8 members of the program were successful. Apollo 8 mission had already achieved that first step in the space program. He was selected to be the first Soviet person to land on the moon and the Lock N1 spacecraft. That was cancelled. Design required spacewalk between lunar vehicles, which is interesting, something that he had contributed to his selection because he had spacewalk experience. Well, that's right, yeah. 12 minutes more than anyone else, I guess. He was to be the commander of the Soyuz 11 mission in 1971 to Salyut 1, but his crew was replaced with a backup after one of the members, cosmonaut Valery Kubasov, was suspected of contracted tuberculosis, and the other member was Pyotr Kodlin. He was to command the next mission to Salyut 1, but this was scrapped after the deaths of Soyuz 11 members, and then the space station was lost. The next 2 Salyuts, actually they were military Almaz station, were lost at launch or failed soon thereafter, and Leonov's crew stood by. By the time Salyut 4 reached orbit, Leonov had been switched to a more prestigious project. This is interesting. He was there when this... there we go, sorry, catching up. There was an attempted assassination attempt on Leonid Brezhnev in Moscow in 1969. His gunman fired 14 shots into the limousine. So this was on January 22nd, 1969. He opened fire on the second car, assuming that it was the one Brezhnev was in it, but that was actually the one which Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, Alexei Leonov, and those other 2 cosmonauts were in that vehicle as well. So, and Brezhnev wasn't hurt at all. Then he got his second space flight that was on the Apollo Soyuz mission in 1975. And here he is as commander of that. And this is a lovely picture. I put it in. This is him and the Apollo commander. He wasn't the commander, was he? Deke Slayton, who was the original Mercury 7 astronaut that was grounded due to medical issues, and later on he got cleared to fly. He wasn't the commander, but he was on the mission, so he finally got to space, which was quite nice. So from 1976 to 82, he was a commander of the cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center, and he was an accomplished artist. He published books of art. He took pencils into space on the Apollo Soyuz mission and drew pictures. And Arthur C. Clarke noted his notes in 2010 Odyssey 2 that after the 68 screening of 2001 Space Odyssey, Leonov pointed out to him that the alignment of the moon and the earth and the sun shown in the opening is essentially the same as that in his 1967 painting Near the Moon, although the painting's diagonal framing is slightly different. So that was quite interesting. So this is the 2 pictures there. Clarke kept an autographed sketch of this painting, which Leonov made after the screening, hang on his wall in his office. And they wrote a script for a movie in 1980, The Orion Loop. In 2001, he was a vice president of a Moscow-based Alpha Bank. 2004, he and former American astronaut Dave Scott began work on a dual memoir covering the history of the space race between the US and the Soviet Union, titled Two Sides of the Moon. I'm not sure if everyone's got that or read that. It was published in 2006. Neil Armstrong and Tom Hanks both wrote introductions to the book. Leonov crater on the near Mir Moscow's Sea of Moscow on the far side of the moon, not the dark side of the moon, the far side of the moon, was named after Leonov in 1970. And there was also an asteroid first observed in 1981, which was named after him as well. Leonov, along with Rusty Swigert, established the Association of Space Explorers in 1985. Membership is open to all of those who've orbited the Earth. So I don't think anyone qualifies in this room, unfortunately. So he had his funeral in Moscow on the 15th of October, and we saw Tereshkova's there and Tom Stafford there as well. Tom's looking a bit worse for wear and tear, but he's getting on there as well. So they were very, very close through all post the Apollo Soyuz mission, those two guys, and did a lot of things together. I do have this 10-minute video. It's probably quite good. We can fit it in, can't we? Yeah. So this is a frame from the outside film of him in orbit, and this is a painting that he did later on, which I think is quite nice. So I've got this little video. We mightn't have time to play it all, but it does talk gives you quite a good overview of his spacewalk. So we'll just run that for a few minutes and see how we go. Oops, that's not it. He didn't get to the moon, unfortunately.
When Alexei Leonov made the world's first spacewalk in 1965, it was hailed as yet another great success for the USSR in the space race against America. It was only after the fall of the Soviet Union that the West found out that whilst it may have been made to look like a success by the Soviet press, it was in fact teetering on the edge of disaster from the moment Leonov stepped out of the airlock to the point when the crew were rescued from a desolate location in a frozen forest. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth to become the first human being to travel into outer space. Immediately on his return, Gagarin toured the world again, but this time grinning to international crowds as a celebrity ambassador for the Soviet Union. The Russians were apparently winning the space race, with 6 Vostok manned missions between 1961 and 1963. However, the pressure was on. The next Soviet space program had to maintain this momentum. The first plans to adapt the Vostok capsule were originally named Advance, and eventually would become to be known as Sunrise, or in Russian, Voshod. In America, the Gemini mission was aiming to fly multi-crew missions, and astronaut Ed White was in training to make the first spacewalk or extravehicular activity, or EVA. Sergei Korolev, the designer in charge of the Soviet space program, believed they could still beat the Americans to the punch. Adapting the Vostok single-seat design, the first Voshod capsule squeezed 3 couches at 90 degrees angles to the central spacecraft controls. The capsule was so cramped that the crew had to adhere to a strict diet just to fit in their seats. Designers considered every way to save weight and space. For example, the ejection seat mechanism was removed. This meant that if anything went wrong in the first 2.5 minutes after launch, there was no way out. This was undoubtedly a risky setup. Voshod's rocket was also adapted, a larger version of the R7, uprated to reach the highest ever manned orbit. But the first flight of Voshod in October 1964 was a success, and in the first months of 1965, Voshod 2 was prepared and readied at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan. On the morning of March 18, 1965, Voshod 2 lifted off, again setting records for speed and altitude in a manned space flight. Upon reaching orbit, cosmonaut Pavel Belyayev inflated the fabric airlock, a 7-minute process, after which Alexei Leonov climbed out to gain the first unencumbered view of the Earth from 475 kilometers, 295 miles in space. Leonov attached an external camera to film the historic spacewalk and appears carefree on the footage. But off camera, the first manoeuvres were clumsy. As he pushed himself away from the spacecraft, he immediately entered a spin, jolting to a stop at the end of his 5 metre 17-foot tether. After a few moments, Leonov noticed that his spacesuit was becoming misshapen. It was unexpectedly ballooning in the vacuum of space. His hands and feet were slipping out of the boots and gloves, and he realised that it might soon become impossible to re-enter the narrow airlock. He only had about 5 minutes of daylight left before the craft would be on the night side and it would become totally dark outside. Without referring to ground control, Leonov made the decision to slowly vent air from his suit until there was less than half the pressure remaining. But then he ran the risk of suffering from decompression sickness. The low pressure worked and the suit regained its correct size. Leonov finally pulled himself into the airlock head first when he should have gone in feet first, causing him to struggle as he tried to turn around in the narrow airlock. This extra struggling caused his body temperature to soar, approaching the danger zone for heat stroke. Eventually, Leonov made it back into the capsule. Humankind had walked in space for the first time, and ground control radioed their congratulations. Leonov's relief must have been palpable. In a recent interview, he revealed that his spacesuit had been fitted with a suicide pill in case he wasn't able to make it back in. However, the danger was far from over. After Belyayev jettisoned the airlock, he discovered that the hatch wouldn't seal properly. And worse, Voshod's automated climate control system was trying to compensate by increasing the oxygen pressure in the capsule. In this super oxygenated environment, any spark could ignite an unstoppable fire. The very scenario which had killed Valentin Bondarenko 4 years earlier as he was in training to become a cosmonaut, and what would go on to kill the crew of Apollo 1 in 1967. But Voshod 2 was lucky. There was no spark and the cosmonauts worked to lower the temperature and humidity, slowing the rise in the oxygen pressure. It wasn't the end of the problems with the mission. Voshod was fitted with an automated re-entry system, but it failed to work. On the next orbit, the crew had to make a manual re-entry burn instead, something no one had done before and would give them little control of where they would land. They made the decision to try and land in the taiga, a vast, almost uninhabited forest in the far north of Russia. The Vosod was so cramped that after the re-entry procedure was started, it took 46 seconds for the two men wearing their spacesuits to return to their seats to restore the craft's centre of mass. This 46-second delay changed their trajectory and pushed the craft 386 kilometres from its intended landing point. As the spacecraft began re-entry, the service module failed to separate, causing Voshod to tumble back and forth until finally the connecting straps burned up in the heat of re-entry. During its descent, Voshod 2 flew right over Moscow's Red Square. Leonov joked to Belyayev, "We could land there if you want," before the craft flew further north and finally landed at 9:02 GMT on March the 19th in the thick, snowy forests of the Ural Mountains. As re-entry had been significantly off course, no one at ground control actually knew where they were. The crew had to spend the night in the woods in minus 25 degrees C as they waited for their emergency radio transmissions to be picked up and their position located. The capsule's heating system also failed to work, and Leonov's spacesuit was full to his ankles with sweat. He later said it was so bad that he'd lost 6 kilos during the flight. Wringing the moisture from their clothes as best they could, the cosmonauts walked for wolves until the recovery crew arrived the next day. But the area was so heavily forested that the helicopter had to land 9 kilometres away, and the rescuers had to ski to the Voshod 2 craft with warm clothes, food, and of course film cameras. Despite being hailed internationally for its success, the numerous failures of the Voshod 2 led to the cancellation of the program. Leonov's famous spacewalk effectively marked the end of the Soviet supremacy in space. The head of the Soviet space program died unexpectedly a few months later in 1966, but the OKB-1 Design Bureau pushed on to develop the Soyuz, a much more capable orbital vehicle, which was first operated in 1967 and is still in use today, and has proven itself to be the most reliable long-term ride into orbit to date. So thanks for watching, and I'd just like to remind you about the Curious Droid Facebook page. The link is in the channel page, and I'd also like to thank all our patrons for their ongoing support, and if you would like to support us, then please visit our Patreon page showing you the link now. So as always, thanks for watching, and please subscribe, rate and share.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Okay, now we've got Angelo de Grazia for his Global Space News segment.
Okay.
Do you know where you are?
Oh, I think so.
Okay, I'll leave you.
Struggle without a mouse, but hey. Onwards and upwards. Okay, now let's put this in the right place. Is this thing working or not?
Yep.
I could hardly hear it down the back. Oh yeah. Blimey. Okay. All right. Bear with me. Of course, I can't see the mouse. Here we go. I'm on. Excellent. Okay. Well, this is not all the news that happened this month, because the amount of news just seems to be going up exponentially. This is a kind of a snippet of the stuff I like, and hopefully you will like as well. The first thing we'll talk about is commercial crew program, and yeah, look, there was a big debacle over a few weeks ago when Jim Bridenstine really criticised SpaceX for focusing too much on. Do we give this up or sorry? What would you like me to do?
I think you're overdoing it.
I think I'm overdoing it? Okay. So he criticised SpaceX for over-focus on Starship. Unbelievable. And so he cast doubts on their schedule, in part because the company hadn't demonstrated the in-flight abort yet, or the abort system, which led to what SpaceX called an anomaly, but Bridenstine called it a catastrophic failure, which is exactly what it was. So Bridenstine also took a little jab at Boeing, but he really had his eyes on SpaceX. Combined with SpaceX's delays would also force NASA to go and buy some extra seats. By the next September, the Soyuz seats are finished, and NASA is now actively looking at getting some extra seats. Okay, and there we have the two commercial crew companies and vehicles. We've got on the left-hand side the CST-100 or the Starliner, and we've got the Crew Dragon SpaceX on the right. Let's talk about Boeing. The latest dates we've got at the moment are they've got a 4th of November pad abort test. It's a 90-second flight, and it'll be conducted in White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. They will not do a in-flight abort like SpaceX will actually undertake. Not sure the reason for that, but that's the way the planning is going at the moment. On the 17th of December, they're going to launch what they call OF2, Operational Flight Test Number 1, and that'll be launched from Kennedy Space Center, and that will be the equivalent of, if you recall, SpaceX's demonstration Mission 1, which was highly successful to the space station earlier in the year. Early 2020 was 2019. We'll get the crewed version of that. It'll be the second test flight. And then in mid-2020 probably, we'll get the first operational mission or the second manned mission to the space station to undertake their contracts with NASA. So that's Boeing. And there you have it. And you'll see the Starliner being mated at the moment for that particular flight in December. Chances are it'll probably slip a little bit, but hopefully not too much.
we'll see what happens. Early to mid 2020, they propose to do Crew Dragon Demo 2, and that'll be where the first astronauts. Now, at the moment, I'd put my money on probably March, but it could go a bit later than that. It all depends on how the in-flight abort system goes, how the parachute validations go for SpaceX, and a couple of other things. Boeing has got similar challenges. Third quarter of 2020, first operational mission to ISS. They have actually, I believe, done it for Boeing. I'm not sure they've done it yet for SpaceX, but yeah, that's the idea. As I said before, there was a little tension between Bridenstine and Elon Musk. However, they smoothed things over because it was getting a little bit nasty, and so for PR reasons, they got into a room and shook hands and said how great they all were, and decided to prioritise the fact that Crew Dragon should fly as soon as possible. So forget about all the starships and all the stuff that Elon's also doing. This was jointly agreed to be a priority. Of course, this will all depend on the outcomes of the abort tests and parachute development. Elon suggested that all the testing would be completed by the year's end. So if that really happens, and they're talking about starting their testing of the vehicle in probably the next few weeks. Again, they will simulate what ended up in a catastrophic failure earlier in this year. They will redo those tests, and then they'll do their in-flight abort. This is the solution. I did play this video before, but essentially SpaceX had designed Crew Dragon to be able to light its Draco thrusters, Super Draco thrusters, at any time, and many times. However, that caused a weakness in the design. What happened was some of the oxidizer and some of the nasty fuels combined and blew the thing up when they were doing an on-pad test. So they fixed that. The Dracos will only be a one-time use. So what they do is they put little blank plates, aluminium plates. As soon as they turn the valve on, the aluminium plates basically burst, let the fuel in, and the escape system works. I won't play that. And there it is. That's actually being put together now. No sound on this one.
Pretty quick.
Very quick. They work fast at SpaceX. So this is the actual... I'm not sure if this is the actual manned version.
So what one are they using for the abort test?
The one that was going to be for the first manned flight is now been moved down the slot to pad abort, and the one that was the first operational mission is now the first manned mission, and I'm not quite sure which one that is. Anyway,
Angelo, the human rating of the Falcon and the issue with fueling the
COP-Vs, and fueling, yeah.
After the astronauts were securing the capsule, that seems to have all gone quiet.
It has, but it's there. Yeah. It's still there, and the COP-Vs are still there. So I'm not quite sure. Just the COP-Vs were the cause one of the accidents on an earlier Falcon some years back. They are the carbon fibre helium tanks that essentially pressurise the fuel in the Falcon. Because of the real low temperatures that they use, what they found was that they delaminated, and bingo, they pretty much cause a spark, and when you're in liquid oxygen, it doesn't go well. But they've been testing, this was a recent test of the Super Dracos, so they know the system works. But they'll be doing more tests up to the flight abort. Okay, and there it is. That's the booster that they will be using for the in-flight abort. And the other one, of course, is the parachute system. Now, in reading, I understand that SpaceX have developed some leading-edge algorithms for designing parachutes, which is excellent because, and Elon Musk has said, I can share this with the world, kind of thing. But a lot of people can benefit from the rigour of the algorithms that they do use, but they believe they've really nailed. This was one of the problems, but they reckon they nailed this now and they've got it right. To the extent that I believe the European Space Agency, who's launching their Mars mission, they've run into trouble with parachutes, and I think there's going to be a little bit of cross-fertilisation to help them, because they've got a window of next year to actually launch their Mars probe, but they've got to get their parachutes right. Anyway, they have 4 parachutes, and I must say, if you remember DM1, the parachutes didn't look very stable to me when it was coming down, but this looks excellent. So they may have ticked that one off the list. Moving on.
Is the capsule reusable?
Yeah, NASA won't, for manned flight, they want brand newies every time, but it is reusable. What they probably will do is they'll turn the one-use capsules into a cargo. There's another cargo contract coming up called number 2. And Dreamliner will be, not Dreamliner, Dream Chaser will be part of that award. That's a little shuttle, little baby shuttle that you might see around. Okay, let's.
Capsule's designed for 10 flights, supposedly.
Yeah, but NASA won't allow that yet for reuse yet. All right, Space Launch System. A NASA official says the first launch of the Space Launch System could slip to as late as the middle of 2021. Surprise, surprise. Remember earlier in the year when Bridenstine and Mike Pence and everyone started, wanted to sack the contractors and do all sorts of weird and wonderful things to ensure a 2020 launch date? Well, guess what? It'll slip into 2021. And that's Artemis 1 mission. And it's been about, 15 years, 12, 13 years in the making, this. And not one engine has been fired in anger yet. So this Space Launch System is a real noose around NASA's head, I've got to tell you. Ground facilities, okay. I might have said this last time, but they're building a second mobile launcher, and it's to do with the various versions of the rocket of the Space Launch System that they're building to avoid having downtime, having to refurbish the first launcher to accommodate the bigger rocket for the second flight. They've decided to build 2 launchers, and so they awarded recently a contract to Bechtel. Has it got the money there? It's there it is, about $400 million. Cute amount of money. Okay, they've also done some water testing. Well, there's what the mobile launcher will look like. But they also did some water testing recently at the Cape, and this is pretty cool. This is for sound suppression. Here we go. That's a serious amount of water. Wait till it gets going. And if anyone's been anywhere near these structures, you'll know that they're pretty big. So that's neat. Moving on. SLS, work resumed on the core stage. They've had a few problems, but they've basically tried to iron out the bugs. There's a lot of words there, but the problem, this page really talks about the problem and the costs. NASA have put their money on SLS and it's costing them a packet. The whole thing to 2035 will end up costing $60 billion. You can pick up a Falcon Heavy for, let's say, $150 million a launch. There's even talk of maybe putting 2 extra boosters on Falcon Heavy, making it almost as capable as the Space Launch System. The bottom line is the American taxpayer are paying a lot for, some call it the Senate launch system. It really does demonstrate that it's about jobs for the boys, this program, unfortunately, and that's the truth of it. And they just awarded a contract. they just awarded the contract to Boeing to build the Artemis 3 mission, and with some negotiations on the next 10 launches of the Space Launch System, and on a cost plus basis, I might add. So Boeing's laughing all the way to the bank. Yep.
Boeing's received over $400 million in bonuses for good performance during the lifetime of the program.
How good is that?
Yep.
They have lots of connections in the government.
Actually, I heard they're doing a new version of this. It's going to be called the SLS Max.
All right, so these are the versions of the Space Launch System. The first one on the left is the one that will carry Artemis 1, and the one that will carry the first men. Artemis 2 is the Block 1B.
And they've got another one for the women?
That probably all-woman crew, I suspect, because you can't trust the blokes, that's for sure. The last version, the cargo version, is about 130 tonnes to low Earth orbit version, and it's quite a capable rocket. Now, this is where the core stage, as they call it, this is what it's made of. The engine section, the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen sections, and the interstage. They are now putting that together to test and to validate their ground systems. They've produced this SLS Pathfinder. It's arriving at the Cape here a few weeks back in the Pegasus. This is an Apollo-era transporter that used to ferry from Michoud in New Orleans all the way to the Cape, up the Banana River there, where they unload. And there it is. It's just a mock-up. But what they do is they validate their ground procedures. And just moving across. Again, this is high speed, but this is in the vertical assembly building. So they're testing the ability to move it and to orient it and to do all the things they need to do to stack the rocket. Okay, moving on. These are the engines that will power the first of the Space Launch System, the Artemis 1. They are 4 previously flown reusable RS-25 space shuttle engines. They've got something like about 16, so they can only launch 4 of them. So they have to restart the production line of the later versions of these, the sort of technologically upgraded versions. But those 4 have previously flown on shuttles. And now they're going to put them into an SLS, fire the rocket, and dump it into the sea. Not quite the way we do business nowadays. So it's very old technology. And in Michoud in New Orleans, this is what they were doing just a few weeks back. Putting it into the real rocket, that is Artemis 1. Also, at Stennis Space Centre, they're going to be doing what's called the green test, where they're going to get the core with the 4 engines in it, and they're going to light it and see how it all behaves. It should be reminiscent of the old Saturn V's tests that they did back in the 66, 67. And further, at Marshall Space Flight Centre in Georgia, they are doing the structural dynamics tests in a big rig.
Is it Alabama?
Marshall, that's in Georgia. Stennis is in Alabama. Or Mississippi. Mississippi. Stennis is in Mississippi? I'm not sure. Does anyone know? Marshall? It is Alabama? Okay, I stand corrected. I've never been there. He's been there.
In the deep south.
Okay, there's the Orion capsule. That is Artemis 1. They also did some testing of the launch abort system.
You got upside down.
But it's an intelligent system. It does all sorts of things, and I think I showed at one of these meetings the video of the abort system off. Remember when they had the abort test, and it sort of turns itself in the sky and rotates itself, orients itself, and then gets itself into the right position. Apollo never did that. This is pretty nifty stuff. Okay, Artemis 1. That's the profile. I suspect it's probably been adjusted, but
Artemis 1 will restore America's ability to reach the moon
with systems built for humans.
Come to a close here.
Orion is the vehicle that's going to take and put the next man and the first woman on the moon by 2024. It's the vehicle that has to take us out of Earth's atmosphere, safely across the expanse of 250,000 miles to the moon, put us in a lunar orbit at the Gateway Space Station, and then sit there and wait while the astronauts go down to the lunar surface for the first time since 1972.
Artemis, this is Houston. Come in. We read you, Houston. It's another beautiful day on the moon.
Then the astronauts are going to come back up to the Gateway, get on Orion, come back home, re-enter Earth's atmosphere, and Orion's going to be the ones going to be able to get us back safely on the ground. We have to come back from lunar return velocities, Mach 32, and dissipate all that energy. So that shape of the capsule that you see behind us is pretty much the same. We've got a heat shield underneath that allows us to re-enter the atmosphere. The big thing is when you get inside, it's 30% larger. Orion can carry 4 crew for 21 days, where Apollo was 3 crew for 14 days. Now, it's also taking a lot of advantage of technology developments, where now we've got glass cockpit. We've got digital displays to control all the systems and are able to give that to us in a digital form, pull up our electronic procedures and emergency function. It also has a lot of better computing power because, while it's only 25 times faster than the space station computers, that's space station's flying right now, but shuttle, it's 400 times faster than that. In comparison to Apollo, 4,000 times faster than the Apollo computers, because Apollo computers had less computing power than we have in our watches these days. A lot more safety redundancies. It also has composite materials, so we're able to make it lighter. We're also able to use 3D printing to make things that we couldn't make before. So it's really going to be next generation vehicle that allows us to have that return to the moon in 2024 and then keep going back every year after that and make that sustained presence on that South Pole that allows us to do all the things we need to be able to be ready to go from the moon to Mars shortly thereafter.
I won't get into that, but the 2024 date relies on funding. That's the bottom line. There's already debates and going on, and it doesn't look like they'll get the funding, which means the 2024 date is probably unachievable, but it may end up going back to the 2028 date. But then again, I suppose it depends on what the Chinese do. So as long as they get the Chinese doing something up there, then maybe the Americans get razzed up again. All right, I won't go into this. We'll do that next time. All right, thank you.
Yes.
Need you all split up?
Yep, yes please.
So
Just while Peter's setting up my presentation, if you want to know more about Alexei Leonov, you might look up this DVD. It's called Spacewalker. It's in Russian with English subtitles, and it tells the story of the Voskhod 2 flight, including the problems they had with it. before you leave, you might want to have a flick through this Russian book, which is Walk in Space, and it was published at the time of Leonov's spacewalk, and it tells a bit about his biography and about the spacewalk. A bit sanitised from what we know it is today. And Peter showed this on the screen, if you want to have flicks through and see whether it's to your taste or not, with Alexei Leonov. Quite a few details in that about Leonov that I didn't know before I read this book. So have a look at those.
Which one, Andrew?
How are we going?
This yours?
Yeah, start with the lowest numbered one. Oh,
sorry, the PowerPoint?
No PowerPoint at all.
Oh, okay, hang on.
Are you in the...
Hang on.
You're in last month's one.
Yeah, sorry.
It's 10. 10th month today. Okay.
With it?
Yep, start with the... right there. Now, because we're running a month behind, we'll get partway through. As I said, we'll get partway through this thing in the...
Sorry, actually click on there.
10 minutes. I sometimes wonder why I bothered doing a whole day preparing this, but anyway. I'm going to talk about Hayabusa 2 first. And the Australian Space Agency has formed had discussions with the people from the Hayabusa team in Japan to arrange for the legally what has to be signed and so on, special agreements, licenses and so on, to land in the Woomera prohibited area. So let's move on. So that's the happy group with the Japanese and the Australians. And that's representative of the sort of area in the Woomera prohibited range where Hayabusa 2 will land. Now, I've got a little story to tell about a misunderstanding. You see here the major components of the Hayabusa mission. We've got the actual spacecraft, Hayabusa, at the top, and on the right-hand side, deployed in September last year, were the Minerva 2 spacecraft with the rovers A and B. They were successful. And then a Mascot was deployed. Now, Mascot was made in Germany, and I'll show you a video of that shortly. And it was successful again. Now, great expectations then for Minerva 2-2. And it's supposed to have a rover as well, which is what was happening in this past month. So, here's a picture of a close-up of the asteroid. And if I can press play. Here we go. On the left-hand side there, you can see the shadow of Hayabusa. No, it doesn't want to play.
Push the silver button. Push the silver little there.
There we go. Now that white thing that you see descending is one of the markers, target markers, TM. You can see it because it's coated in a retroreflective material. And where's the light coming from? Well, it's coming from the sun. These drops are done with the sun behind us. And so the sun shines on the retroreflector and back to Hayabusa. Okay, so that's how the target marker looks when it's dropped. You can see the spacecraft shadow there on the left-hand side of the screen. All right, let's move on to another picture of, that's the area where the crater was made. It's called Hiroshima crater now, and that's where they landed and took a sample. Now, the rover 2, the one they dropped a few days ago. Now, touchdown speed of the rover 2 on the surface will be about 0.5 metre per second. And that's about dropping something from about 1.5 centimetres on Earth. So it's not going to be damaging. The idea was then it would do a micro hop with an electric eccentric motor. I'll show you how that works in a moment. Elastic reaction movement using leaf springs. A permanent magnet was going to help it move, and it also has a MyCam imager. Now, the elastic reaction mechanism using bimetal springs will react with the temperature changes due to the periodic sunlight and shade on Ryugu as the asteroid rotates. And that should produce hopping motions. So, all great expectations when that was dropped. But there's a part of it I hadn't read. I'll come to that later. So here's the manoeuvre 2-2, and you can get from the screen there, you can read the size and so on. And the actuators are again on the left-hand side of the screen, and it also has sensors to tell, the camera is going to be the one that most people are interested in. And here are the actuators. Now, a bimetallic strip works in the following way, if you watch me here. Different metals expand at different rates. So if you've got them tied together and one expands more than the other, it will bend over. And when it cools down, it will come back. So the idea was that this temperature changes on that would cause this to flick over, and that would cause an impulse which would make the thing tumble. Remember, the gravity there is so slight that the slightest movement would send it tumbling. And you can read the other ones there. I don't have time to go through all the other ones, how they work. So it was quite expectations on different ways that could get it to move across the surface. Well, November 8 last year, there was this press conference. Now, I should add that I've been watching some of these press conferences, but I've been watching it in Japanese. I don't understand Japanese, not a word of it. And I don't read it either. So I've been looking at the pictures and trying to work out, from what's happening. However, finally got a translation. And after launch, the onboard status check procedures were performed for the manoeuvre 2-2 on December in 2014. And again 2015 and 2017. Then the communication link was confirmed between the Hayabusa 2 and the rover. However, the telemetry data on the internal state of the rover 2 had not been obtained due to booting anomaly of the rover data processing system. The same symptom was observed in the pre-launch tests. Through the ground-based testing analysis using non-flight engineering model, the possibility of a fully functional rover operation is considered very low. In other words, they knew this damn thing wasn't going to work even before they launched it. But they went ahead and launched it anyway. Well, you have to meet a schedule. So, as of end of last year, the consortium was studying an operation plan that will produce meaningful results through the deployment of the second rover, which was scheduled for about July of 2019. So, how come I didn't notice that? Well, you see, that translation only became available recently. So what do we got here? We've got on the thing, we've got 5 of these retroreflectors, and the order of separation is shown there. And last year they dropped B, and then earlier this year in May they dropped A. And then we've got C and E to be deployed. So when I saw this diagram, I think, what the hell? They normally come really close and drop this marker down to a specific place. Why on earth are they dropping these things down and it's doing this crazy thing and taking hours and hours and hours to land instead of just going down and landing on the surface where they can know where it is? And I couldn't figure this out. What on earth was going on? Because you see, I hadn't read the details, that earlier fault in the plan. So they dropped those 2 markers, and here's a picture of one of them going down. It's actually a series of pictures then superimposed on the thing. And it's not dropping away, because what's happened is it's going down so slowly. Once they released it, they then commanded Hayabusa 2 to back away from the asteroid. And it took photographs of the thing apparently receding into the distance. Now, and here's the other marker, target marker being dropped. So, September 24, reporter briefing in Japanese. So when I came to the last meeting, which I never had time to talk about anyway, I was prepared to tell about how the thing had been dropped and how fantastic it was, and to expect the pictures coming back soon. Well, later, the Japanese gets translated into English, and I get this part of the briefing notes. And also, Tohoku University also did a briefing explaining what they're doing. And here's the part that I didn't read the first time I saw this document. The following onboard instruments on Rover 2 will not be functioned unless their data processing system is restored. In other words, it's not going to work. So what the heck are we going to do? Well, all those micro-hopping and so on is no point. It's not going to work. So what they're going to do, what they decided to do instead, was to drop those markers higher than normal, and then watch what happened to them, and thereby get a better idea of the gravity field of Ryugu. So it says at the bottom there, instead of operating Rover 2 on the surface for the mobility and imaging missions, the idea was to develop to release the rover at a higher altitude and put it into orbit to go around Ryugu. If the orbital motion of Rover 2 is observed by the optical cameras from Hayabusa 2, we will make a better understanding of the gravity field of Ryugu. So there I was, having not read that, because it was, hadn't been translated by that time, knowing that the rover had been deployed, and saying, why aren't they publishing any pictures of it? It should have come down within a few hours of release. Well, in fact, they put it into orbit and it stayed in orbit for several days before finally descending down to the surface. And it says there, the operational plan to inject Rover 2 into an equatorial orbit toward the direction of Ryugu's rotation. So here's what they developed to do. They were going to eject it in the orbit in the direction of the rotation. It'd be an equatorial orbit. It should have lasted about 5 days, during which time it would have gone around Ryugu about 8 times. And remember that Ryugu has an orbital, the spacecraft would have an orbital period around Ryugu of about 17 hours. And on the left-hand side, at the lower left there, you can see schematics of the expected orbit. So the science from it is not the pictures and landing and all that sort of stuff they were going to get. It's now tracking the orbital motion of the maneuver to see what it does in the gravity field, and therefore better map the gravity field of Ryugu. So they sort of salvaged some good science out of a bad deal. So here we go. This is the target marker separation, and the results of the separation of the target markers. I haven't got time to read through that. And here's what maneuver the rover did. After separation at an altitude of 1 kilometre, much higher than they intended originally to drop it from, you see that it's in an elliptical orbit. So that's why the altitude goes down and up, and then finally it landed on the 10th of August. So that's something that sort of only dawned on me slowly over a period of time. Okay, quickly with Osiris Rex, last thing here. Last time I told you about the plan to land in different landing sites, and there were 4 of them shown in that video which I showed last time, so I won't do it now again. And they've decided on 2 sites, and they'll finally decide in December the final one they're going to land on. So one's called Kingfisher, and the other one's called Sandpiper. And I have some detailed pictures of the Sandpiper site. And you can see down the lower right-hand side there, the orange dot there marks where it will land. And this is a close-up of Sandpiper, and gives you an idea to scale. Here's a car parking lot with some cars parked on the asteroid. Yep, let the conspiracy theorists go with that picture. And that's where I got to last time. Start of last month's talk. So there's next month's talk already ready to go. So there we go. Oh, there's lots of interesting stuff in there, including what's happened with Insight. There's a story about Insight. Do you want to hear it now?
Yep.
All right, I'll quickly skip Didymos then. New findings about us. This is the Indian mission to Mars. And that's the Emirates mission. You know, the Emirates put an astronaut in space, or the Russians put it up for them. Okay, now the mole. Remember the mole was supposed to dig itself down, and it wouldn't go down. It got stuck at an angle, so they lifted the thing off it. And I won't play the video because it's about a minute long. And quickly, they then decided that, well, there's not enough friction in the soil. It needs friction, it needs to grip the soil to go down. So what they did is they used the scoop to push down the soil and sort of compress it. And then they said, okay, let's dig. And they went went down. And they said, yay, it's working, it's going in. But, yeah. And that's a picture of how they tried to compress the soil. And that's the latest. Yeah, it was hammering down and went and came back out again. So now they're saying, okay, let's gather everyone around the world who's involved in this thing, including there's an Australian helping with this, and try to figure out what the heck are we going to do. But it did confirm one thing though. The suspicion was that it got stuck and went at an angle because it hit a rock. Well, they confirmed by the fact that it was able to go down even deeper before popping back out that it hadn't hit a rock. And the analysis is the soil is just not compact enough to allow the thing to get a grip. So what happens is it goes, a little widget goes boom, and it just hits it and bounces back. So it doesn't go in any further. It doesn't have enough grip. So what the hell are we going to do with that? That's the question. All right, well, we better shut up there. Otherwise, the wonderful owners of this hotel will be kicking us out the door. So it's all set for next month.
Thanks, Andrew. Just got one little bit. Okay, so that's it for this month. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you all the speakers, Andrew and Rowena and Michael and Angelo and everyone else. Thank you for coming out tonight. Next month we look at the 50th anniversary of Apollo 12, and this isn't a photograph of I'm on the moon, but that's quite a nice picture actually. But this next one is, and it's exclusive. You'll be able to see it tonight. Pete Conrad and Al Bean on the moon in 1969 November. How do we do it? Well, they had a timer, a little self-timer. They took it along to the moon. They did take a self-timer. Unfortunately, this picture is a fake. But they did take a timer, and they were going to plug it into the camera. I don't think they told anyone about it. And then run back and get their photo snapped. Unfortunately, they lost it in the bag, etc. But they did find it again. But this is a really nice picture because it gives you an idea of the location of the lunar module and the surveyor, which they aim to land nearby. So the remarkable navigation and flying that they did to get that close was quite excellent. And they took a few pieces of that back to the Earth. And if you go to the Washington Air and Space Museum, you'll see a couple of pieces of that. I got this picture actually from a official NASA site. And if you want to look at that URL, it's this Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. They've got a page there called Fun Pics, and it's like a crowdsourced. People have put together different mocked images, paintings, other things, missions that never were, parts of the missions that did happen, but then there was any photographs, and people put things together. It's actually quite a bit of fun to float around and have a look in there. So I urge you to take a look at that. That's it for tonight. Thank you once again for coming out tonight. And once again, if you haven't put your name on that sheet out there and you're unknown to us, please put your name out there. Next meeting is the 25th of November, the Tuesday. And Monday. What am I talking about? Tuesday. I was thinking about Tuesday. Yeah, okay. So Monday the 25th. Thank you very much. And once again, the T-shirts and the book. So thanks again.